Hey students, so I'm going to be discussing chapter 2, which is thinking like a researcher. And like I mentioned in the previous video, I do bite-sized pieces of knowledge when it comes to research methods and other courses I've taught. So it's a simple, easy discussion board question I wanted to speak about. Construct versus variables. So the chapter discusses constructs, which are theoretical concepts, and variables, which are measurable representations. Would you be able to provide, if I were to ask you in class, would you be able to provide one or two examples, a student choice, whichever one they want to, relevant to your field as a student, and explain how you might operationalize each one as variables? So I know it sounds like a complex question. It's really not, and I'm going to walk us through that now. So, for example, chapter 2 discusses that constructs are abstract theoretical concepts that researchers want to study, while variables are the measurable indicators that are used to represent those concepts in real research. Because constructs cannot be observed directly, researchers must then operationalize them by defining specific ways to measure them through variables. Operationalization then, of course, turns an idea into something observable and testable, which relates to our chapter 1. We discussed about observational phenomena and being able to do a study about something. So, for example, let me talk about leadership effectiveness, for example. Leadership effectiveness is a theoretical concept which describes how a leader influences performance, morale in the company or the organization, goal achievement among employees. And it's abstract because effectiveness cannot be directly observed by only one single object or behavior by the leader. It can't be observed by that. So if you have an operationalized variable, for example, I might use something where I look at employee satisfaction scores, and you could do what's called a Likert survey, and everybody has probably seen that. On a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel about blah, blah, blah? Is McDonald's better than Burger King, for example? I have no idea. Or there's team performance outcomes, which are goal completion rates or productivity metrics. There's employee turnover or retention rates. There's a 360-degree feedback evaluations. Some of this should probably seem very familiar to students because I'm sure most of you, if not some of you, have gone through employee evaluations. I myself have to do that each year. Each of these variables then, of course, represent a measurable indicator of the broader construct. And together, they provide empirical evidence about leadership effectiveness. So you can look at the overall picture of how effective the leader is in that organization. Another example could be about employee job motivation. So the job motivation refers to an individual's internal drive or the willingness to exert effort at work. Since motivation is psychological, it cannot be observed directly. And of course, there are operational variables where the construct can be measured through self-reported motivation surveys, as I mentioned earlier, about Likert scale agreements, with statements like, I feel energized by my work. Attendance or absenteeism rates. How often do people not show up to work? How often they're absent? The level of voluntary participation in extra tasks or projects. There's persistence on challenging assignments, work assignments. Now, these measurable types of behaviors and survey responses serve as variables that approximate the underlying construct of motivation. So that's how you can figure out whether it's something you want to motivate or not, and how effective the leader is in terms of job motivation also. You could also look at, for example, a couple of other ones. You could look at brand image for athletes. Some of you watch, soccer, football, baseball, basketball, whatever, right? And there's all kinds of brand images going on. Now, in sports communication and public relations, you have an athlete's brand image. It influences directly fan loyalty, sponsorship opportunities, loyalty towards the team, right? Media coverage and public perception. But the idea about brand image itself is very abstract, and it cannot be directly measured. So it's harder to do because it's kind of abstract. It's kind of can't really measure per se, right? But you could try. You could still try ways to do it, which would, be a good effort, right? There's social media sentiment scores, percentage of positive, neutral, negative mentions in social media. Let's say you look at Twitter or you look at Instagram or maybe TikTok, Facebook, social media accounts basically. And they mention positive, negative, neutral mentions, how people feel about something, right? Fan perception survey ratings, Again, you could do Likert scale items, such as I view this athlete as trustworthy, or the athlete is a positive role model. There's media tone analysis, the percentage of positive versus negative news articles or headlines. There's endorsement volume, number of active brand partnerships. So that's another way to look at these different types of like variables basically that you're looking at to look at the whole picture to complete everything. And that's basically a way that you could understand and figure out the broader construct of an athlete's brand image. LeBron James, or who else can I think of right now? I'm not a big sports person, so clearly I don't really know this stuff. James Harden plays for the Rockets, for example. So I know we have a lot of sports people in our program, so I'm sure you can probably think of some ideas about that. The last example that I want to speak to you about that relates directly to public organizations and public trust, community trust in sports organization. You could look at, for example, some students probably know this actually. Very often, it's very rare actually. All these sports stadiums that we have, say in Houston, we have the Houston Dynamo Energy Stadium we have for the Texans. There's Dakin Park for the Houston Astros. So all of that is these sports teams. They're sponsored by corporations like NRG, right? NRG is electricity and energy and gas, right? So NRG Electric sponsors NRG Stadium, and there's another one, I think Gillette Stadium in Boston or Pennsylvania, wherever it is. But students know what I'm talking about, of course. It's SoFi Stadium. They are representative of that bank or that energy company or whatever there is that has put their name, their logo on a stadium that they have mainly sponsored. But students also may not know this. That's not the entire picture, actually, of the sports team where they get their money from for the stadium. Very often, cities also float bonds, municipal bonds and such, because they're sort of wooed by the sports team owners to spend money because they claim, the sports team owners, that it will generate jobs in the area. And jobs are always good for the economy, which is good for politicians. Now, the majority of research shows that that's actually really not true. For example, the average football stadium, as expensive as it is, it's actually only used 10 days of the year. It's a very expensive thing to build, and you're only using it for 10 days of the year, mainly for football. Now, there could be other events that go on there that, you could use it for. But generally, the stadium in the past has only been used for 10 days of football season, and that's it. In a year, they have 365 days. So a lot of students can understand why a lot of public citizens and even politicians are thinking this is not a good idea. We have to use it for something else. Hence why you see so many sports stadiums now have concerts, and they have events and festivals and things like that, because they have to do it. They have to make sure that stadium is used. Otherwise, taxpayers are going to be very upset about that. So you should think about public trust and public trust in relation to the sports organization. And the sports organization, if they're a losing team, then there's going to be less public trust. And why do we give you all this money if you're not making any money for us and you're not winning? We want you to win. We gave you all this money. Why are you not winning? So you could look at other ways in terms of like scandals, injuries, league controversies, public meltdowns, or YouTube, or someone goes to a club and they shoot their foot off with a gun they were not supposed to be carrying. This was an actual incident. Some students may know about that story from years ago. It affects ticket sales, which of course affects sponsorship, and affects a long-term reputation. So if you'd operationalize into some variables, right? The public trust could be measured through fan trust survey scores, something I mentioned earlier, right? Agreement statements like, I trust this organization to act ethically. Ticket renewal rates. So for example, you could have percentage of season ticket holders who renew. How often do they do that? Sponsor retention. That's another one. Percentage of season ticket holders who renew. So there's all kinds of ways that you can figure this out, right? There's also crisis response perception ratings. Survey items, for example, could be assessing how well the organization handled a public issue. Together, these variables provide observable evidence of the underlying construct of brand trust, public trust. These examples then highlight how sports communication concepts operate on two planes. Constructs like brand image and public trust exist on the theoretical level, But to study them scientifically, they must be translated into measurable variables on the empirical level. This process of operationalization is what allows researchers to test relationships, such as whether stronger crisis communication leads to higher public trust, or whether positive media tone improves athletic brand image. So those are just some of the examples I wanted to provide you today for thinking like a researcher. How would you operationalize variables? I hope it was useful. I hope you were able to learn something, and I hope that I see you in my next video very soon. Thank you again.